The desert air shimmered like a living enemy in the summer of 1942, turning steel into an oven and men into shadows behind dust-covered goggles. Somewhere in North Africa, an entire Allied tank battalion sat stalled under the sun, engines ticking and groaning, radiators belching steam instead of power. German artillery was close enough to hear, close enough to feel through the ground. If those tanks didn't move soon, they wouldn't just be abandoned, they'd become tombs. And in the middle of this crisis stood not a general or an engineer with medals, but a grease-stained mechanic whose name history almost erased. He had no rank that commanded attention, no blueprint approved by headquarters. What he had instead was desperation, instinct, and a terrifying idea that might either save hundreds of lives or destroy the last working machines they had. This is the story of how one ordinary mechanic, under unbearable heat and impossible pressure, made a choice that rewrote survival itself. Tank warfare was never meant for the desert. The engines were designed for Europe's forests and fields, not endless sand that swallowed air filters and baked steel until it screamed. The Allied tanks, mostly British Crusaders and early American Grants, were overheating at a catastrophic rate. Radiators clogged with dust in hours. Cooling fans sucked in sand like a vacuum, and engines seized without warning. Crews learned the sound of death intimately. The sudden drop in RPMs, the metallic knock, the hiss of boiling coolant. When that sound came, the tank was finished. The crew had seconds to escape before internal temperatures turned the fighting compartment into a furnace. Maintenance reports piled up with the same words written again and again. Engine failure due to overheating. Commanders blamed manufacturers. Manufacturers blamed the environment. Meanwhile, men kept dying. The battalion's mechanics worked day and night, hands burned by hot metal, lungs heavy with oil smoke and dust. Among them was Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer, a former civilian auto mechanic pulled into the war because he knew engines better than rifles. Mercer wasn't a hero by training. He'd never fired a shot in anger before arriving in Africa. His war was fought with wrenches, rags, and intuition. He listened to engines the way doctors listen to hearts, head tilted, eyes closed, feeling vibrations through his palms. And what he felt terrified him. These tanks weren't failing slowly. They were being cooked alive. Mercer knew the textbook solutions: improve airflow, clean filters, reduce operating time. None of it worked long enough. Radiators were simply too small for the heat load, and the cooling systems were never designed for temperatures that warped metal before noon. Requests for redesigned parts would take months. Months the battalion didn't have. German panzer units were adapted for desert warfare, their maintenance routines hardened by experience. Every immobilized Allied tank meant fewer guns when the attack came. At night, when the camp finally went quiet except for distant shell fire, Mercer lay awake replaying the sounds of failing engines in his head. He thought about the young crews who joked nervously before climbing inside, pretending the heat didn't scare them. He thought about the responsibility he felt every time a tank rolled out after he'd signed off on it. If it died out there, some officer would mark it as mechanical failure. Mercer would know it was personal. The idea came to him not as inspiration, but as fear. He remembered racing engines back home, how overheating was sometimes controlled not by stronger radiators, but by forcing airflow and controlling pressure in ways manuals never mentioned. The thought felt dangerous, maybe even insane. It involved intentionally changing how the cooling system breathed, redirecting airflow in a way that went against factory design. If it failed, engines could seize even faster. If command found out, he could be court-martialed for sabotage. Mercer stood in front of a silent tank just before dawn, its metal skin already warm, sand crunching under his boots. He placed his hand on the engine casing and whispered, almost to himself, "You can't survive like this." In a few hours, the battalion would be ordered forward again. There would be no time for approval, only a choice. By midday, the heat had become physical, pressing down on the camp like an invisible weight. Even standing still drained strength. Men spoke less now, conserving breath, conserving hope. Orders whispered through the battalion, prepare to advance at first light the next morning. Mercer heard them while bent over an open engine bay, his shirt soaked dark with sweat and oil. Every instinct in him said the tanks would never survive another sustained push. They would overheat, stall, and die in open ground, and the Germans would finish the rest with shells and machine guns. He could almost see it already, burning hulks, crews scrambling, the stench of fuel and fear layered on desert air. The cooling system diagrams ran through his mind like ghost images. Intake, radiator, fan, exhaust, elegant on paper, useless here. The real problem, Mercer realized, wasn't just heat. It was trapped heat. Air went in carrying sand, clogged the fins, and had nowhere efficient to escape. The engine bays became pressure chambers of death. What if the engine didn't need more cooling components? What if it needed space to breathe? It was an idea no regulation allowed. Mercer believed the solution lay in deliberately venting hot air upward and backward, cutting controlled openings in the engine housing and forcing airflow out instead of letting heat spiral inside. In civilian racing, such methods existed, but tanks were not race cars. Altering armor plates was unthinkable. Armor was sacred. It was supposed to protect lives, not be cut open by a mechanic with a torch. The risk cut at Mercer's gut. He imagined German rounds finding those openings, fire licking inside the engine bay, accusations whispered after funerals. But then he remembered the men who had died already when their engines cooked them alive without a single shot fired. Officially, those losses didn't count as combat deaths. Unofficially, Mercer carried every one of them. He chose a tank no one expected to survive anyway, its engine already unreliable from weeks of punishment. Working with two trusted mechanics who asked no questions, Mercer marked sections of the rear engine deck with chalk. Their faces were tight with unease as they followed his instructions. When the cutting torch ignited, its roar felt too loud for secrecy. Sparks sprayed against the sand like falling stars. Each second felt like sabotage against everything the Army taught them to believe. As sections of metal were removed and improvised louvers fashioned from scrap, Mercer's doubts grew louder. Was he breaking the tank or saving it? There was no guarantee, no test field, only heat, pressure, and the screaming need for a miracle. When the modifications were finished, the sun was already sinking, the sky burning red as if reflecting his fear. They filled the radiator, sealed what seals they could, and climbed aside as Mercer signaled for ignition. The engine roared to life, angered by the changes. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Mercer felt it, the heat rushing out, escaping upward instead of choking the compartment. The engine temperature climbed, and then stopped. It held steady. No one spoke. They only stared, listening to the sound of something that should have failed, but didn't. The engine ran longer than any of them had seen in weeks. It was not proof. It was not safety. But it was enough to force an impossible question into Mercer's mind as the tank shut down under control rather than catastrophe. Dawn came without mercy. The desert offered no softness, no forgiveness, only light, heat, and exposure. As engines started across the battalion, the familiar stench of fuel mixed with dread. Mercer stood beside his altered tank, hands shaking not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that everything now depended on what no one had authorized. At any moment, an officer could notice the cuts in the armor. At any moment, orders could come to restore it to regulation. None did. War rarely had time to question desperate improvisation. When the column began moving, Mercer rode on the back of a supply truck, eyes locked on the modified tank as if staring could will it forward. The first hour was always deceptive, heat still manageable, metal not yet screaming. It was the second hour that killed engines. As miles passed, Mercer watched the familiar signs appear everywhere else. Tanks pulling aside, hatches opening, crewmen spilling out as steam erupted upward, overheating again, breakdown again. But the modified tank kept going. Its exhaust shimmered, hot air venting visibly from places heat had once been trapped. Inside, the crew felt the difference immediately. The engine noise stayed even. No metallic knocking, no sudden loss of power. One crewman later said it felt like the tank was finally exhaling instead of suffocating. Mercer didn't hear those words yet, but he felt them in his chest as the temperature gauge refused to climb into the red. By midday, the impossible became undeniable. The altered tank had outpaced others, stayed mobile longer, and crossed terrain where identical machines died in the sand. Word spread the only way it ever does in war, quietly, urgently, man to man. Other mechanics approached Mercer with wide eyes and tight voices. "What did you do?" he was asked. He hesitated. Saying it out loud made it real, made it dangerous. Still, when tanks failed, men listened. Under the shadow of a half-functional command structure stretched thin by losses, Mercer gave instructions in fragments. Cut here, vent there, force airflow. Mechanics copied him with whatever tools they had. Scrap metal became louvers. Bolts and welds replaced factory symmetry. Every tank looked different by the end, each one bearing scars of survival. The battalion moved again before sunset. This time, fewer engines died. Fewer crews abandoned their vehicles. And when the German advance finally came, fast, precise, lethal, the Allies had something they hadn't had in weeks: mobility. Tanks repositioned instead of burning in place. Guns tracked targets instead of falling silent. Men lived long enough to shoot back. Mercer watched the battlefield from behind a ridge, ears ringing with cannon fire, heart hammering with something more potent than fear. Pride tried to rise, but he crushed it. This wasn't about ingenuity or recognition. This was about whether his gamble would hold when shrapnel flew and engines ran at full strain. A panzer shell hit one of the modified tanks, ripping armor and killing the engine in a violent burst of flame. Mercer flinched, stomach hollowing. Had his cuts worsened the blast? But the crew escaped. They lived. The tank hadn't become a coffin. In that moment, Mercer realized the truth he had been too afraid to name. His insane idea wasn't perfect. But neither was the old way. And perfection had never saved anyone in war. As night fell and the guns went quiet, reports came in. Tanks still operational. Losses reduced. One battalion commander, exhausted and grimy, asked a single question over crackling radio. "Who the hell fixed my tanks?" The next morning, the desert looked different. Not cooler, not kinder, but charged with consequence. What Mercer had done could no longer be ignored. Tanks across the battalion bore the unmistakable marks of modification: rough-cut vents, improvised louvers, armor scarred by necessity. They looked wounded, unfinished. They also worked. Command officers walked the lines slowly, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes narrowed. This was not standard. This was not approved. And yet, the reports couldn't be denied. Operational readiness had improved. Breakdowns had dropped. Crews were surviving longer missions under temperatures that had previously crippled them within hours. Tactical flexibility, the quiet, uncelebrated backbone of survival, had returned. Tanks could maneuver, retreat, advance. They could fight. When Mercer was finally summoned, it wasn't to a ceremony. It was to a tent heavy with cigarette smoke and silence. Maps covered the table. Stress lines cut deep into every face present. A senior officer asked him to explain exactly what he had changed. Mercer spoke carefully, stripping emotion from his words, laying out airflow patterns and thermal escape like a confession. He expected anger. He expected punishment. Instead, he saw something worse and rarer: fear. These men realized how close they had come to disaster by trusting doctrine over reality. One officer muttered that the manufacturers would have to hear about this. Another asked if the design could be standardized. Mercer gave the only honest answer he had. It helped. It didn't make tanks invincible. Nothing ever did. Word filtered upward slowly, through channels dulled by bureaucracy and distance. Somewhere far from the desert, engineers and officials would later debate the safety implications of altered engine decks. Reports would be written with careful language, credit diluted, responsibility softened. But in the field, what mattered was immediate. Other units began copying the idea on their own, adapting it to different models. Variations appeared, some better, some worse. A few failed, most helped. That uncertainty never left Mercer. Each time a modified tank rolled out, he watched until it disappeared into heat haze, wondering if this would be the one that proved him wrong. The nights stayed long. The desert stayed hot. The German guns never rested for long. Survival remained fragile, conditional, earned again every day. Mercer received no medal. No newspaper ever printed his name. Official histories would later attribute improved desert performance to operational adaptations and revised maintenance procedures. But men remembered. Crews who came back alive placed hands on Mercer's shoulder without words. Mechanics nodded to him across camps, as if sharing a secret no one else could understand. Weeks later, as replacement tanks arrived with improved ventilation designs inspired in part by field reports, Mercer finally allowed himself to feel something close to relief. Not pride, not triumph. Relief that his fear-driven gamble had tipped the scale, however slightly, away from pointless loss.